Hello and welcome to the Watershed Wise Landscape Professional Certification Module 10, final module, Integrated Resource Management. Here is the deal that we are all having to confront, and that is that when we talk about land management, landscape management, so many of the functions in a landscape is such an integrated system that much of the regulation of it and practitioners for various services that are encompassed in landscaping, scientists who study things having to do with landscaping or land management, and managers of resources, water agencies, soil agencies, etc. They're completely siloed from each other. There's very, very little cross-pollination of even communication. And as a result, we get these approaches that are very singly focused. So it's, the example of the stormwater agency not wanting you to put water in a landscape that has clay soil. If they talk to the people, the scientists who are studying the living soil and microbial activity in soil, this would be a different conversation. If they talk to irrigators, it would be a different conversation because they would have an understanding that in fact landscapes get this water on a regular basis, usually. And it would sort of reshape the conversations and reshape the policies and perhaps speed up the regulation and the support that landscape managers are working with. And I think that the thing is here, we consider this watershed approach to really be able to become a model that we can kind of rally around, and that we can rally we can entice people from all these different silos to come together and start with a watershed approach to landscaping, and then take that back and begin to think about that in the particular area where they are practicing or where they're focusing their efforts. So to recap what we have talked about so far, and sort of preview, we have been talking about managing water in the landscape. We've talked about how water moves through a landscape and how it's recycled back into the atmosphere by plants, and how an irrigation system would help to replenish water that had been removed from the soil by plants. We talked about healthy living soil and how that creates a soil sponge of carbon that holds on to water in the landscape when it's dry and releases it when it's wet. So kind of manages the amount of water that's in the soil, and that plants are actually engineering that system so to their benefit, so that they have the water that they need when they need it, and they are able to get rid of water when they don't need it. Then we talked about how rainwater can be captured off of hard surfaces and directed into landscapes, and that water is is a free resource and wouldn't have to be brought through a potable system. And all of that has been around managing plant available water. If you think about it, right? It's all been around managing the water in the root zones of the plants. That has been really the key topic of this entire course so far. And we are going to take it even a step further, because it turns out that the plant available water is the most important water, I think, on the planet. It's the most important fresh water on the planet. And guess what? We landscape people, we're the ones in charge of that. How cool is it? We're going to save the world. Okay, but we need to make sure that the bridges that we build are actually, thoughtfully constructed and that we're talking to each other, or else we're never going to get anywhere. All right. So I'm going to start this conversation. Well, I started already, but I want to launch the next level by doing a little thought experiment. So what is the most abundant greenhouse gas that's essentially causing this problem? Do you know what it is? Well, if you said water vapor, you are right. Water vapor is the most abundant greenhouse gas. And who makes the water vapor over terrestrial areas? These guys do. These guys and all their friends and all their microbial friends, they're the ones who actually manage the water over terrestrial areas. So here's an interesting thing. Every day, the sun shines down this incredible resource, and also it's an incredible energy, right? It's, I'm going to have to read it because it's 10 megawatts per 2.5 acres, which is the equivalent of having 2 nuclear power plant blocks every 4 square miles. That's the energy of the sun. And what happens when that energy comes down onto the earth? Well, it, this incredible amount of energy, 2 things can basically happen. It can either hit a reflective surface and go back up, be radiated back, or it can be absorbed. What absorbs the energy of the sun? Plants. Plants absorb the energy of the sun. Water does too. But over terrestrial areas, we're really interested in the plants because they're utilizing that energy of the sun to actually manage water vapor and so forth. And so if we don't have plants, I mean, this is kind of the bottom line. If we don't have plants covering the earth areas, we're screwed because it's just going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. And all kinds of terrible things are going to be happening. So we need plants, not just, for drawdown and all this other stuff, but we need plants to be managing this water vapor in the atmosphere and also be absorbing this heat. And the heat that is coming from the sun, the heat that we are particularly concerned with is called sensible heat. Sensible heat is heat we can measure with a thermometer. It's the heat that we feel on our skin. And there are other kinds of heat, but sensible heat is the one that kind of causes the most problems when there's too much of it. So vegetated systems are actually doing some interesting things. First of all, we have already addressed this. We know that vegetated systems are storing water in the soil, and we know that they're promoting water cycling. So they're basically using the solar power to do this function. Now, that cycle of storing water in soil and then putting it back up into the atmosphere is evapotranspiration, and cycling, having that water condense and come back down on terrestrial areas is called the small water cycle. Now, there are two main water cycles that we're going to talk about, but we're going to concentrate on the small water cycle because this is the predominantly terrestrial water cycle. It happens over the ocean also in some areas, but this is what's happening on land. If we want, yes, and this is the water cycle that is managed by plants. Now, before we had urban, suburban development, like before we had to even think about LID and, nature-based solutions, the small water cycle worked perfectly fine. The amount of water that was coming from the sky was held in plant material, it was held in soils, and then over time, and very little of it ran off into rivers and creeks and so forth. And the main way that the water was being cycled was through this plant and soil system. And the plants were making plenty of evapotranspiration up into the atmosphere, and they were that was condensing and falling as rain on the terrestrial areas. So this small water cycle worked really well, and sensible heat was being absorbed by the plant system. And, things were pretty balanced. Regular precipitation over land areas. There were also regular precipitation over oceans with the small water cycle over the oceans, but most importantly, regular precipitation over the land areas. And that was a great system, except what happened? We started interrupting that small water cycle by developing and getting rid of the plant material. Now, the other water cycle that we want to be thinking about is called the large water cycle. The large water cycle is the one you mostly hear about because it's the one governed by the oceans, and it's the one that is reacting most adversely to the rise in temperature. What is going on is, as more of the sensible heat is being reflected up into the atmosphere, we're actually getting a more radicalized large water cycle because the oceans are heating up, and this is affecting the amount of water in the atmosphere, and it's also affecting the currents, and a lot of stuff is happening in this oceanic water cycle, which is really the big water cycle for the planet. And the oceans are basically this like big buffer of water to circulate water throughout the, the earth. Where do we live? Yeah. So the large water cycle or big water cycle is from the oceans. And the small water cycle pales in comparison to the big water cycle. And because of that, we often don't hear about it. It's not something that is in the environmental, milieu, or the conversations that are had about a warming planet mostly are focused on what's happening in the large water cycle with the oceans, because we see it so dramatically when we have warming oceans that are putting, more warm water vapor into the atmosphere and ending up creating these, very volatile storms that are, that drive the news. There must be a water cycle that drives the news slide here that we could do. Meanwhile, the small water cycle has become increasingly broken. When it was there, we didn't, there would be no the recognition of it, we wouldn't have as much of a recognition of it because things were working. We didn't have these dramatic storms in the ocean and so forth. But as the small water cycle has gotten broken, it's even diminished more, because it's like having the tantrum child in the room, right? The large water cycle is the tantrum child. Meanwhile, the other child that doesn't scream as loud, but has lots of problems, is being lost. I'm not sure that's a great analogy, but you get where I'm coming from. All right. So the way that we can kind of describe this is that because we no longer have a broken small water cycle, and because of that, our land areas are actually they're absorbing heat, but ending up reflecting it back, because they're built environments instead of vegetated environments. So they're not absorbing it into the plants and into the soil. They are reflecting it back into the atmosphere. And what happens is, when we have these very vast surfaces that are reflecting all this heat back into the atmosphere, not only are we not cycling the water properly through the vegetated system, but we are also creating a heat island effect. And that heat island effect is like an umbrella. Where we have these hard surfaces that are reflecting back vast amounts of heat, we're actually creating these like almost like a dome, an umbrella over those systems that keep them getting warmer and also thwart any regular precipitation that might be trying to come from the large water cycle into that area. So the heat island effect is a result of the degraded land area. The degraded land area has diminished the small water cycle. The big water cycle is getting more volatile. And meanwhile, the areas that actually need the water, like inland areas, are pushing the water that would be coming to them away. And all of this comes back to the lack of vegetation. And oh, by the way, one of the results of this is that the large water cycle ends up having to dump its water in coastal areas more frequently than making its way inland. The inland area has the heat dome that pushes the water away, and it all gets pushed to the coastal areas. And so these huge storms end up really affecting the coastal areas that are, cooler and so forth. And meanwhile, the inland areas suffer from less water coming at all, volatile storm or not. So you can see it's sort of a double whammy that's going on. And yes, this heat island effect comes directly from desertification. It comes from the lack of vegetation on the land and the lack of healthy soil that is able to manage, manage that vegetation. So when we degrade the soil and we degrade the vegetation, we end up really, creating this giant heat island effect and reflecting more of that sensible heat back up into the atmosphere instead of absorbing it. And so here's the thing: as that reflected heat warms up the environment and warms up our oceans, the weather becomes even more variable. So that large water cycle becomes even more unstable. And a warm atmosphere holds a lot more precipitation, a lot more water than a cold atmosphere. So we're ending up not just with gentle storms anymore, but now we have these deluges that are massive amounts of water in very short, we have, what are they called? Weather bombs, or I guess the one was a snow bomb, but we end up getting these weather bombs or water bombs where we're getting 100-year storm volumes at a rate of that many inches per hour on a regular basis. It's no longer a 100-year storm because we've destabilized that large water cycle. And even if everything was unchanged, from where it is now, this global warming that we are experiencing is actually going to intensify this water cycle even more. So, it's kind of on a path that it can't be changed. The large water cycle, it could be changed over a vast time, but it's going to require, it's kind of out of our scope in a way. But it doesn't mean that we can't create a buffer. And what we basically need to do is we need to restore the small water cycle, because actually the small water cycle used to essentially take energy out of the large water cycle. Because we don't have the small water cycle doing its thing anymore, that reflected energy, that sensible heat, is going into driving the big water cycle. So if we removed that amount of energy from this whole system, if we started absorbing that energy back into the soil, back into the plant material, and we reestablished the gentle cycle of terrestrial precipitation that came from plant material, we would be taking energy out of this large water cycle and over time realigning the large water cycle so that it's not having to respond to such high temperatures. And this is a full-on global warming thing. Like, we talk about carbon and everything else that's going on, and it is super, super important, and drawdown is important, and plants do drawdown, oh, by the way, as we have determined. And this water cycle thing is how people actually experience global warming. So we can influence the experience that people have with weather and with global warming by making sure that we vegetate as much of the land as we possibly can and restore the soil to a functionality of a spongy soil, and allow the rainwater that is created to go back into the ground so that it can be cycled in this gentle, small water cycle. There is a direct correlation, and in fact, not just correlation, but causation between urbanization and the heat island effect. It also is a direct correlation and causation of urbanization and overdrafting of groundwater, and ultimately of soil degradation and desertification. Urbanization is what is creating desertification. We talked about that in the very, very beginning, but now we're coming back to it because we can see what the water cycle is through plants and soil. We can actually calculate it and understand it for our own property and for a very localized solution. And we can convince people to be more engaged in creating vegetated spaces that are in healthy soil sponges, so that we can reduce desertification, because the more desertification we have, that's the destruction of land, right? The more desertification we have, more heat island effect we have, the more volatile our storms are going to be, the more coastal areas and areas that are vulnerable are going to be pounded by these volatile storms, and the more epic drought we're going to be seeing in inland areas. The answer to all of this is restoring a healthy, balanced watershed. And that's why the watershed approach is so important. We want to make sure that we create this balanced watershed so we manage not just the terrestrial small water cycle, but in doing so, we end up affecting the oceanic large water cycle. Now, what is the water that we are talking about here that's the most important water? Because yeah, we've been talking about storms and all this stuff, but the water that is involved in this small water cycle is called green water. And you can read, in fact, we're putting in, the resource is going to be in the course, an entire paper from the UN about green water and the importance of it globally. All the stuff that I just talked about. But it's cool to identify it, because guess what? Green water is the fresh water that is stored in the root zones of plants. Does that sound familiar to you? Plant available water. Hello. Plant available water is green water. And that is the water that is cycled through plants to become precipitation and is managed by plants. All other water is blue water. Blue water is water that you identify in a water body like a creek or a lake or ocean or river or whatever. That is blue water. And even the water in the atmosphere is essentially blue water. But when the water is cycling through plants, it's green water. And the water that's in the root zone of plants is green water. And it is very low impact development, nature-based solutions that enhance green water. And we manage green water in the same way, or we evaluate the management of green water in the same way that we evaluate the management of irrigation. Plants are removing water from the green water reservoir, and they need to have that water replenished in the green water reservoir. The best way to replenish the water in the green water reservoir is to capture rainwater into that reservoir, because that's the natural cycle. pumping it out of the ground and putting it into the plants, not as good. Maybe okay in a short term to get something going, but it's not as good. Bringing water in from another watershed to replace the green water, not as good. What is good is precipitation and using that in the green water. So anytime we talk about green water zone, we're going to also be talking about the plant available water zone. And here's the thing. Agriculture and irrigation, the two, or agriculture and landscape, the two sort of main ways that we think about land management are that we, the sciences that are associated with agriculture and landscaping have come up with a paradigm that says there's only 6 inches of topsoil on the planet. That's what we care about. Roots are, basically equivalent to turf grass roots, maybe 6 inches, 12 inches. I mean, we talk about a plant that has deep roots, 18 inches. That's pretty much the thing. Well, imagine if we could start growing land areas, landscapes that had root depths like the ones that we were seeing on the prairie, those 15-foot root depths. I mean, heck, just get me to 2 feet, 3 feet. And imagine that plant available water is enormous, right? Think about the calculation, your total irrigation runtime. I mean, well, you'd stop. Actually, you wouldn't even get the total irrigation runtime. You would see allowable depletion, of 3 feet and be like, I don't think this thing has to be irrigated, right? So this understanding of water in the system and the plant available water, and the two components of it being the soil that it's in, which we know now is healthy living soil that behaves more like the organic matter on the available water holding capacity chart. So it stores a huge amount of water because it's all carbon based, big amount of water in great soil structure so the water can be taken out by plants and at a root depth that is phenomenal. So we need to be thinking about how do we restore all these systems? Not only now when we think about irrigation, instead of it just being, okay, we irrigate in order to optimally grow XYZ plant. What if we started thinking about irrigation more about, well, I'm managing the green water in this space, and I'm going to apply irrigation only after I know that whatever rainwater I've been able to collect in this green water zone has been depleted. Then I'm going to turn to irrigation to supplement that utilization of the rainwater first. When I think about plant available water as green water, my priorities shift in terms of how quickly I irrigate, the kind of water I irrigate with, and just the whole management really of my irrigation approach. And I know also that when I'm managing my green water now, I'm actually having impact on a lot of other things. So I'm going to show you a very quick residential case study of, this is a site where it was all turf grass and one invasive grass species. And across the street is a river. So these people were very concerned about the water that was coming out of the downspout and going straight into the street. That is connected under the grass. Let's see. Oh, yeah. And so they wanted to know, hey, how could we hold on to water? Well, they took a class that we taught on sheet composting or sheet mulching, which is essentially covering the soil in a little compost paper to suppress weeds and to promote fungal growth, and then mulch, wood chip mulch on top, lots of water, and it basically cooks down the grass that is on the site and turns it into beautiful soil that has a beautiful soil structure that you can, use as a sponge. And they were interested in that. They took the class and they tried it. And something interesting happened. So there's a lot going on in this picture. The first thing is the thing in the very bottom of the picture. You can see this, we came to the site about a month after they had done their sheet composting, and you could still read the newspaper that they had used to do the work. So what does that tell you? If you're trying to promote microbial activity here in this landscape, well, they certainly have plenty of food. They had the compost down, they have this grass there that they were trying to get rid of. That's plenty of organic matter. They had the mulch on top. What were they missing? Well, it's water. They were missing water. It needs to be water because, remember, soil is a water environment. So getting those microbes going, you need water. So that's one challenge. The second thing is you can see that there's a hose dragged through the middle of the landscape. That is going to be the path of the rain garden that they are going to want to create. And I showed this earlier, but look at that. Look at that. Do you see that? Those are spray heads. There's another one. And where do you find the spray heads spraying? Oh, against the house. So one of the things that we were going to be asked to do here was to eliminate those spray heads. And how could we do that? So what we decided was we were going to actually hold on to the rainwater without putting in an irrigation system. So there it is. That's where the downspout connects to the street. And instead, we're going to redirect that downspout into the landscape, slowing, spreading, and sinking it on the way. And we are also going to remediate this very dry sheet composting. And the way we do the remediation of the dry sheet compost, let's see if I have a slide. No, we're going to actually auger with an 18-inch drill bit, 3/8 inch in diameter. We're going to put some holes into the landscape at regular intervals, like every 3 feet or so. And then we're going to fill in some worm castings in that and water it thoroughly. And in doing that, we are adding oxygen, water, and life to this landscape to get that soil party going. The homeowner here actually developed their own plan, and they selected pretty much all climate appropriate and many native plants that they actually gathered seed for and grew from seed. And the objective was to do this with hand watering only. After a few months of this sheet composting in the summertime, enough heat was there that was generated, and that grass was broken down and turned into soil. Do you see grass anywhere? No, because it was eaten up by the microbes as organic matter. And a little bit of the mulch was too. And now what we are doing is we are actually come back to contour to hold on to the rainwater catchment. You can see here that we've actually created 2 swale areas. And it's because we discovered another downspout. But those swale areas have a berm in between. The young lady in the middle is standing on top of the berm, and there are also berms against the sidewalk. And you can see that the ground is sloped away from the foundation now of the residence. And believe me, the water damage is going to be a lot less now because we're capturing rainwater than it was running the irrigation system, because you can see there, look at that water damage right there. It's crazy. And this is what it looked like when we were finished. They actually really liked rock, so we couldn't talk them out of it. A lot of rock in here. But this is a dry creek bed kind of configuration. The downspout has been cut and redirected into the landscape. And we have these contours, berms, and depressions. And we've planted the plants in the landscape, mulched it thoroughly. And now we're going to see what happens. And at the top left, we have the first rain event. It was actually 4 inches of rain over a very short period of time, just a couple of hours, and an unusual rainstorm for this area. And all that water got captured. All the water that fell on this site stayed on it, no overflow. But in addition to that, all the water from the roof got put into this rain garden as well. And it so happens that the roof surface area is about equivalent to the land area of the landscape. So while this landscape got 4 inches of rain from the sky on the ground, which is great that it held on to it, it also got those 4 inches off of the roof. So in one rainstorm, this garden got 8 inches of rain. And because it's designed to hold on to this water and infiltrate it, and the healthy soil is there and everything else, it's fantastic. How long do you think the water was there? It was there for just a couple of hours while it went into the soil sponge. So pretty amazing. And then number 2, it rained again. Just a month or 2 later, it rained another 3.5-inch rainstorm. Again, unusual for this particular area. But now, not only is it capturing 3.5, but it's capturing it from the roof as well. So it got 7 inches total in that rainstorm. So in 2 rainstorms, which is really all that happened in this year, this landscape got 15 inches of water, which was an average annual rainfall. The landscape next to it, the grass landscape, and the ones in the background, they didn't get it. And on top of it, oh, by the way, all of those downspouts, the water ran right out into the street over to the river. So direct connection of pollution to the waterway. Not at this place. This place functions totally differently. And then as we went into the dry season, because this is in an arid west area that doesn't get snow, as we went into the spring and into the dry season, no irrigation is required. And things grow incredibly fast because they're essentially irrigated with rainwater. There was some supplemental hand watering when new plants got added into it, but essentially no significant irrigation. And now this landscape lives on rainfall. And you can see in the lower right-hand side, this was a couple years after the initial installation. So it just lives on rainfall. Now, we want you to think really carefully about residential lawn. Okay, that's maybe have a pony. Okay, if you have a pony, it's a really good reason to have a lawn. I just want to say, ponies get a pass if you have a pony. Or maybe you've already taken steps to minimize that lawn. Man, good on you. That's a way to go. Minimizing is definitely important. But we want to have landscapes that actually have forage and water and places to nurture young and all of those things, because we want a living landscape. We want something that celebrates the life and also provides for all those creatures that are reliant on this ever decreasing green area, at least until we get our hands on it and start increasing it again. Install a drip irrigation system or avoid irrigation altogether. I love this picture because it really shows, how many people does it take to install a drip irrigation system? You can tell that they're trying to figure out how that irrigation should be wound around those plants. Invite friends for planting day. It's great. By the way, the backpack sprayer that's on there is compost tea, not herbicide. And resist the urge to overplant. Did you know that when you stand up and put your arms out, the distance between your fingertips is the same as your height? For most people. I think I've met 1 or 2 people that doesn't apply to, but for most people, that's the case. So if a plant says that it has a 5-foot canopy, or it's going to grow to 5 feet width, believe it. And in fact, it's probably underestimated, right? Because they're afraid to tell you that it's actually a 7-foot plant. So measure it out, space your plants accordingly. Don't stress plants by planting them too close together. That is one way that we end up creating a lot of green waste, because things have to be clipped or removed. And also it harms the life of the plant. Start with small plants and watch them grow, because small plants will almost always catch up to larger plants in the same time period. So if you plant a plant that's in a smaller can size, it's going to catch up to that and surpass the larger plant that you planted at the same time. And they do grow. Here's the same garden in very short period of time. Treat every property as a mini watershed. We get it, right? And keep managing the water. Every garden is going to need maintenance. There's no such thing as a no maintenance garden. Xeriscape is not zero maintenance. I like to tell people we are going to have to manage something having to do with bugs, and at least think about it. And, you know, the solution used to be that we would just grab whatever was advertised as being an effective killing device and kill everything in the process, just point and shoot. And we killed all the fungi, and we killed all the good bacteria, and we killed, you know, the plants and the bugs and everything, and ourselves, actually, as we found out now through various lawsuits. And now, instead of that, we use integrated pest management. Why? Because landscapes are integrated. They are not single solutions. Integrated pest management has a cycle that starts with observing and identifying and monitoring what's going on, evaluating the situation and the results from your monitoring, then taking steps to prevent that activity. If you have to, taking action, and there's a hierarchy of action, which I'm going to show you in a second. The application of herbicides and so forth is actually the lowest option. I mean, that, or highest option, I don't know, it's the last option. There are many other things that you can do before that. And then, of course, monitoring the effects of the program that you've decided to integrate, or utilize. So integrated pest management is the way that we reduce the risk to humans for managing pests. And, you know, one of the things that we need to do is identify the pest and decide whether it's a pest. And also, what's our tolerance level? You know, does it matter that there's a little bit of this or a little bit of that? Maybe not. And we have management tools at our disposal. I guess it is at the highest point, but it means it's the least, it's the last one. We start with prevention. That's the first tool in integrated pest management. And we move through tools until we get to chemical. And chemical is really the last resort. And most of the time, in fact, almost all the time now for us, we never get there. Prevention includes plant selection, making sure that you're getting healthy plants from the very beginning, and that if they are food cultivars, they're resistant to particular pathogens, making sure that you have a diversity of crops. So this rotating crops is one thing, but diversity is what we're talking about. Make sure you've got polyculture, creating barriers, keeping things, when it says sanitation, it means kind of keeping an eye on things and keeping things clean. There's a trade-off in sanitation. I think I mentioned this before in Living Soil, but I'll do it again. I learned a huge lesson at a very large botanic garden that had a world-class collection of camellias. I don't know if you're familiar with camellias or not, but there's a particular blight, a virus really, that attacks camellias, and it makes the blossoms turn brown and fall off at various stages. Sometimes, like, it falls off even before it blooms. And this can devastate a camellia collection. I mean, it's really terrible. And so the practice that had been implemented, and you were told as a landscaper who came into contact with camellias, the practice was sanitation. You cleaned up all of the blossoms that might have an issue. You never allowed any blossoms to gather underneath. You blew away all the leaves. You kept the soil completely devoid of organic matter. How's that sound? Does that sound like that's building an immune system in the plant? So this particular collection, when you go to visit them, there is a duff of leaves and blossoms and everything on the ground, like right there under all these camellias. World-class collection of camellias, right? Precious. And they've got this duff of debris. They don't blow it away. They don't sanitize. And the reason that they don't is because they realized that if they allowed that debris to be there, the soil party, especially the fungi, would sample that, whatever the pathogen was. And if it was a virus, so be, it would sample that, and it would actually begin to manufacture response and distribute that response to the whole collection, so that all of the plants then would have a response to that pathogen. So sometimes the answer isn't blow it away, sanitation. Just want to keep your eye on it. A little bit maybe, but Think about having some natural predators. That's a really good way to go. And also, you know, your cultural practices. I would say one of the most important things about dealing with plants is cleaning your pruning utensils. Mechanical practices to keep, you know, gophers and so forth. I love that picture of that little gopher. I love gophers. I think gophers are fantastic. I'd rather get an owl. Chemical control only when needed and always in combination of other things. And then, of course, an analysis of did it work. Observation is the key to management of landscapes. And here's a great example. Do we have good coverage of the grass? If it's a spray system, what is our distribution uniformity? Are we, you know, do we have head-to-head coverage? We do not have head-to-head coverage. I can tell you that right here. Or do we have, you know, these silos around the spray heads? Head-to-head coverage, you have to have head-to-head coverage to have good distribution uniformity. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that with spray systems. When's the best time to water? Well, follow your local requirements. We recommend actually, I don't agree with this. I know this slide says 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., but I don't agree with that. I think it's more like 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Really focusing on that nighttime watering when it's cooler and there's less wind. The key here is that it's not a problem to water at night, and watering at night doesn't cause pathogens. Poor practices like overwatering causes pathogens. Using a soil probe is really important. We want to know what's going on in the root zone. Obviously, the root zone is where it's all happening. This is typical turf, so you want to make sure that you're you're managing this right. But deep roots are possible, and that's really what we want to try to encourage. Deep roots that's our green water right there. This grass is going to be resilient in times of drought. So the ways to stimulate deeper roots are, you know, it's not just about watering in a particular cycle. That's kind of a misnomer. You must be building the soil at the same time, because otherwise you are just stressing these plants. So it's a combination of watering in the correct irrigation interval with the correct irrigation water applied, and also building healthy living soil. That sponge is the critical thing. And most of the reasons that we get disease are about stress. You know, in turf, this is all turf oriented, but stress is really the thing, whether it's drought stress or overwatering stress. Both are terrible for plants. We may be pruned too frequently. In the case of turf, it's mowing. Or maybe we have created an environment where things are too close together and they're not able to have any air movement. That's also a potential problem. There have to be, all three components have to be present in order to get a disease. It has to be either an anaerobic condition, because remember, pathogens are anaerobes for the most part. So you need to have some kind of anaerobic situation, and an soil party that is not activated, for example, is another thing besides anaerobic. And then you need to have some environmental stressor. It's too shady, it's been pruned too hard, it's been overwatered, it's been underwatered. And then you have to have some kind of a host. So if it's a monoculture, it's ready to be attacked. And that's another reason why grass, turf, is one of the least compelling things for a garden, because it basically invites invaders. Here are some invaders: Pythium blight, snow mold. Oh, pink snow mold. Ooh, I don't love that. Dog urine. Those dogs, they're invaders, but they do nitrogen burn. So we include this slide because you would be amazed how many people want to know what to do about nitrogen burn. I mean, it's dilute it with a little water and put down some compost ASAP. And again, your problem is because you have a monoculture. If you had a polyculture here, it would be less likely to show that kind of damage. We've got all kinds of lawn pests that we want to be thinking about, the white grubs and June bugs, the cutworms, all of these things. But again, healthy living soil is the answer in most of these cases. The answer to compaction is to dethatch twice a year, making sure we get oxygen into the soil on a regular basis, aerating, and always feeding with good compost to kickstart that soil party. And here we go. We are going to post the study about the insects. Someone asked us a question about the insects and said, very smartly, how can insects like nectar but not be able to process sugar? That is a great question. And what we found out is that insects have organs that allow them to process particular kinds of sugar, but the sugars that are created by a microbial community in a healthy plant, I'm going to kind of liken it to nutrient density. Okay, so it's like a plant that has nutrient density and is sweet in that way, and sugar is most of what the nutrient density is. Those are unattractive to the plants, to the insects, because they cannot process that sugar. It's like having a human having a problem processing sugar and eating an apple. That is going to have one response. But if they sat down to a bowl of candy with that kind of sugar, two different kinds of sugar, the second one, or even a couple of pieces of candy, that would have a different response than the low glycemic apple might be. So this is the sugar thing, and we're going to check out that article in the materials. Mowing too close definitely is a problem, because what happens is when you cut more than a third of the plant, that plant actually stops putting out exudates into the soil. And exudates are what manage the soil party. So you don't want to mow too close. Really, 4 inches is great for cool season grass. And 4 to 7 inches, remember, is the optimal grass. So manage that root depth. Keep things longer. Mowing tips: have your own mower. Make sure your blades are sharp. That's a really important one, actually, so that the cuts are clean. Mow it when it's dry and cooler, and leave the clippings on the soil, because that's nitrogen-rich organic matter that can feed the soil party. Try a natural lawn, which means overseeding with clover and other forbs, where you're basically creating a polyculture out of the lawn. And that complex ecosystem is far more resilient. It's more resilient to cold. It's more resilient to heat and certainly to drought. Another maintenance practice worth talking about is removing debris from the roof, from the gutters. Make sure you do that before a rainy season. This is a firescaping issue, and it's also a rainwater catchment issue. And you want to make sure that you get rid of the leaves from clogging up like the bottoms and downspouts and so forth. If you can, avoid gasoline-powered equipment. We don't need any more fossil fuels out there. Use electrical. Clear your brush and manage your vegetation with animals. There is actually a symbiotic relationship between land, the microbes in the soil, and animal intervention. Animal integration will stimulate the soil party, and actually the saliva of the ruminants stimulates the soil party. It's like a crazy, beautiful, integrated system. So let's try to use as many integrated approaches as we possibly can. And I want to thank you very much for joining us for this course, which is finished now with this module.